So I rode with the king most of the time, sitting up in front of him on his skittery black mare. I wasn't sure I could trust her not to bite me or to kick me when I wasn't looking. But King Lear told me, "It is only peaceful times that make her nervous. Be assured of that. When dragons charge her, belching death, for the fumes are more dangerous than the flames, little one. When your griffin swoops down at her, you will see her at her best." I still didn't like her much, but I did like the king. He didn't sing to me the way Schmendrick had, but he told me stories. And they weren't fables or fairy tales. These were real, true stories. And he knew they were true, because they had all happened to him. I never heard stories like those, and I never will again. I know that for certain. He told me more things to keep in mind if you have to fight a dragon. And he told me how he learned that ogres aren't always as stupid as they look, and why you should never swim in a mountain pool when the snows are melting, and how you can sometimes make friends with a troll. He talked about his father's castle, where he grew up, and about how he met Schmendrick and Molly there, and even about Molly's cat, which he said was a little thing with a funny crooked ear. But when I asked him why the castle fell down, he wouldn't exactly say, no more than Schmendrick would. His voice became very quiet and far away. "I forget things, you know, little one," he said. "I try to hold on, but I do forget." Well, I knew that. He kept calling Molly Suze, and he never called me anything but little one. And Schmendrick kept having to remind him where we were bound and why. That was always at night, though. He was usually fine during the daytime. And when he did turn confused again and wander off, not just in his mind either, I found him in the woods one night, talking to a tree as though it was his father. All you had to do was mention a white unicorn named Amalthea, and he'd come to himself almost right away. Generally it was Schmendrick who did that. But I brought him back that time, holding my hand and telling me how you can recognize a puka and why you need to. But I could never get him to say a word about the unicorn. Autumn comes early where I live. The days were still hot, and the king never would take his armor off except to sleep, not even his helmet with the big blue plume on top. But at night I burrowed in between Molly and Schmendrick for warmth. And you could hear the stags belling everywhere all the time, crazy with the season. One of them actually charged King Lit's horse while I was riding with him, and Schmendrick was about to do something magic to the stag, the same way he'd done with the crow. But the king laughed and rode straight at him, right into those horns, and I screamed. But the black mare never hesitated, and the stag turned at the last moment and ambled out of sight into the brush. He was wagging his tail in circles, the way goats do, and looking as puzzled and dreamy as King Lear himself. I was proud once I got over being frightened, but both Schmendrick and Molly scolded him, and he kept apologizing to me for the rest of the day for having put me in danger, as Molly had once said he would. "I forgot you were with me, little one, and for that I will always ask your pardon." And he smiled at me with that beautiful, terrible hero's smile I'd seen before. And he said, "But oh, little one, the remembering." And that night he didn't wander away and get himself lost. Instead, he sat happily by the fire with us and sang a whole long song about the adventures of an outlaw called Captain Cully. I'd never heard of him, but it's a really good song. We reached my village late on the afternoon of the fourth day, and Schmendrick made us stop together before we rode in. He said directly to me, "Suze, if you tell them that this is the king himself, there will be nothing but noise and joy and celebration, and nobody will get any rest with all that carrying on. It would be best for you to tell them that we have brought King Lear's greatest knight with us, and that he needs a night to purify himself in prayer and meditation before he deals with your griffin." He took hold of my chin and made me look into his green eyes, And he said, "Girl, you have to trust me. I always know what I'm doing. That's my trouble. Tell your people what I've said." And Molly touched me and looked at me without saying anything. So I knew it was all right. I left them camped on the outskirts of the village and walked home by myself. Malka met me first. She smelled me before I even reached Simon and Elsie's tavern, and she came running and crashed into my legs and knocked me over, and then pinned me down with her paws on my shoulders and kept licking my face until I had to nip her nose to make her let me up and run to the house with me. My father was out with the flock, but my mother and Wilfred were there, and they grabbed me and nearly strangled me, and they cried over me. Oh, rotten, stupid Wilfred, too, because everyone had been so certain that I'd been taken and eaten by the griffin. And after that, when she got done crying, my mother spanked me for running off in Uncle Ambrose's cart without telling anyone. And when my father came in, he spanked me all over again. But I didn't mind. I told him I'd seen King Lear in person, and had been in his castle, and I said what Schmendrick had told me to say, but nobody was much cheered by it. My father just sat down and grunted, "Oh, aye, another great warrior for our comfort and the griffin's dessert. Your bloody king won't ever come here his bloody self, you can be sure of that." And my mother reproached him for talking like that in front of Wilfred and me, but he went on, "Maybe he cared about places like this and people like us once, but he's old now, and old kings only care who's going to be king after them, and you can't tell me anything different." I wanted more than anything to tell him that King Lear was here, less than half a mile from our doorstep, but I didn't. And not only because Schmendrick had told me not to. I wasn't sure what the king might look like, white-haired and shaky and not here all the time, to people like my father. I wasn't sure what he looked like to me, for that matter. I mean, he was a lovely, dignified old man who told wonderful stories. But when I tried to imagine him riding alone into the midwood to do battle with a griffin that had already eaten his best knights, to be honest, I couldn't do it. Now that I'd actually brought him all the way home with me, as I'd set out to do, I was suddenly afraid that I had drawn him to his death. And I knew I wouldn't ever forgive myself if that happened. I wanted so much to see him that night. Schmendrick and Molly and the king. I wanted to sleep out there on the ground with them and listen to their talk, and then maybe I'd not worry so much about the morning. But of course there wasn't a chance of that. My family would hardly let me out of their sight to wash my face. And Wilfred kept following me around, asking endless questions about the castle, and my father took me to Catania, who had me tell the whole story over again and agreed with him that whomever the king had sent this time wasn't likely to be any more use than the others had been. And my mother kept feeding me and scolding me and hugging me, all more or less at the same time. And then, in the night, we heard the griffin making that soft, lonely, horrible sound it makes when it's hunting. So I didn't get very much sleep between one thing and another. But at sunrise, after I'd helped Wilfred milk the goats, they let me run out to the camp, as long as Malka came with me, which was practically like having my mother along. Molly was already helping King Lear into his armor, and Schmendrick was burying the remains of last night's dinner, as though they were starting one more ordinary day on their journey to somewhere. They greeted me, and Schmendrick thanked me for doing as he'd asked, so that the king could have a restful night before and I didn't let him finish. I didn't know I was going to do it, I swear, but I ran up to King Lear, and I threw my arms around him, and I said, "Don't go! I've changed my mind! Don't go!" Just like Lysanne. And King Lear looked down at me. He seemed as tall as a tree right then, and he patted my head very gently with his iron glove. He said, "Oh, little one, I have a griffin to slay. It is my job." Which was what I'd said myself, though it seemed like years ago. And that made it so much worse. I said a second time, "I've changed my mind. Somebody else can fight the griffin. You don't have to. You go home. You go home now and live your life and be the king and everything. I was babbling and sniffling and generally being a baby. I know that. I'm glad Wilfred didn't see me. King Lear kept petting me with one hand and trying to put me aside with the other, but I wouldn't let go. I think I was actually trying to pull his sword out of its sheath, to take it away from him. He said, "No, no, little one, you don't understand. There are some monsters that only a king can kill. I've always known that. I should never, never have sent those poor men to die in my place. No one else in all the land can do this for you in your village. Most truly now, it is my job." And he kissed my hand, the way he must have kissed the hands of so many queens. He kissed my hand, too, just like theirs. And Molly came up then and took me away from him. She held me close, and she stroked my hair, and she told me, "Child, Suze, there's no turning back for him now, or for you either. It was your fate to bring this last cause to him, and his fate to take it up, and neither of you could have done any differently, being who you are. And now you must be as brave as he is, and see it all play out." She caught herself there, and changed it. "Rather, you must wait to learn how it has played out, because you are certainly not coming into that forest with us." "I'm coming," I said. "You can't stop me. Nobody can." I wasn't sniffling or anything anymore. I said it like that, and that's all. Molly held me at arm's length, and she shook me a little bit. She said, "Suze, if you can tell me that your parents have given their permission, then you may come. Have they done so?" I didn't answer her. She shook me again, gentler this time, saying, "Oh, that was wicked of me. Forgive me, my dear friend. I knew the day we met that you could never learn to lie." And then she shook both of my hands between hers, and she said, "Lead us to the Midwood, if you will, Suze, and we will say our farewells there. Will you do that for us? For me?" I nodded, but I still didn't speak. I couldn't. My throat was hurting so much. Molly squeezed my hands and said, "Thank you." And Schmendrick came up and made some kind of sign to her with his eyes or his eyebrows, because she said, "Yes, I know," although he hadn't said a thing. So she went to King Lear with him, and I was alone, trying to stop shaking. I managed it after a while. The Midwood isn't far. They wouldn't really have needed my help to find it. I mean, you can see the beginning of it from the roof of Ellis the baker's house, which is the tallest one on that side of the village. It's always dark, even from a distance, even if you're not actually in it. I don't know if that's because they are oak trees. I mean, we have all sorts of tales and sayings about oak woods and the creatures that live there, or maybe because of some enchantment, or because of the griffin. I mean, maybe it was different before the griffin came. Uncle Ambrose says it has been a bad place all his life, but my father says no. He and his friends used to hunt there, and he actually picnicked there once or twice with my mother when they were young. King Lear rode in front, looking grand and almost young, with his head up and the blue plume on his helmet floating above him, more like a banner than a feather. I was going to ride with Molly, but the king leaned from his saddle as I started past and swooped me up before him, saying, "You shall guide and accompany me, little one, till we reach the forest." I was proud of that, but I was frightened too, because he was so happy, and I knew he was going to his death, trying to make up for all those knights he'd sent to fight the griffin. I didn't try to warn him. He wouldn't have heard me, and I knew that too. Me and poor old Lysanne. He told me all about griffins as we rode. He said, "If you should ever have dealings with a griffin, little one, you must remember that they are not like dragons. A dragon is simply a dragon. Make yourself small when it dives down at you, but hold your ground and strike at the underbelly, and you've won the day. But a griffin, now." A griffin is two highly dissimilar creatures, eagle and lion, fused together by some god with a god sense of humor. And so there is an eagle's heart beating in that beast, and a lion's heart as well, and you must pierce them both to have any hope of surviving the battle. He was as cheerful as he could be about it all, holding me safe on the saddle and saying over and over, the way old people do, 2 hearts, never forget that, many people do, eagle heart, lion heart, eagle heart, lion heart, never forget, little one. We passed a lot of people I knew, out with their sheep and goats, and they all waved to me, and called, and made jokes, and so on. They cheered for King Lear, but they didn't bow to him or take off their caps because nobody recognized them. Nobody knew. He seemed delighted about that, which most kings probably wouldn't be. But he's the only king I've met, so I can't say. The Midwood seemed to be reaching out for us before we were anywhere near it. Long, vingery shadows stretching across the empty fields, and the leaves flickering and blinking, although there wasn't any wind. A forest is usually really noisy day and night, if you stand still and listen to the birds and the insects and the streams and such. But the Midwood is always silent, silent. That reaches out to the silence. We halted a stone's throw from the forest, and King Lear said to me, "We part here, little one," and set me down on the ground as carefully as though he was putting a bird back in its nest. He said to Schmendrick, "I know better than to try to keep you and Suze from following." He kept calling Molly by my name every time. I don't know why. "But I enjoin you, in the name of great Nikos himself, and in the name of our long and precious friendship." And he stopped there. And he didn't say anything more for such a long while that I was afraid he was back to forgetting who he was and why he was there, the way he had been. But then he went on, clear and ringing as one of those mad stags. "I charge you in her name, in the name of the Lady Amalthea, not to assist me in any way from the moment we pass the very first tree, but to leave me altogether to what is mine to do. Is that understood between us, dear ones of my heart?" Schmendrick hated it. You didn't have to be magic to see that. It was so plain, even to me, that he had been planning to take over the battle as soon as they were actually facing the griffin. But King Lear was looking right at him with those young blue eyes, and with a little bit of a smile on his face, and Schmendrick simply did not know what to do. There wasn't anything he could do, so he finally nodded and mumbled, "If that is your Majesty's wish." The king couldn't hear him at all the first time, so he made him say it again. And then, of course, everybody had to say goodbye to me since I wasn't allowed to go further with them. Molly said she knew we'd see each other again, and Schmendrick told me that I had the makings of a real warrior queen, only he was certain I was too smart to be one. And King Lear said to me, very quietly, so nobody else could hear, "Little one, if I had married and had a daughter, I would have asked no more than that she should be as brave and kind and loyal as you. Remember that, as I will remember you to my last day." Which was all nice, and I wished my mother and father could have heard what all these grown people were saying about me. But then they turned and rode on into the Midwood, the 3 of them, and only Molly looked back at me. And I think that was to make sure I wasn't following, because I was supposed to just to go home and find out if my friends were alive or dead, and if the griffin was going to be eating any more children. It was all over. And maybe I would have gone home and let it be all over, if it hadn't been for Malka. She should have been with the sheep and not with me, of course. I mean, that is her job, the same way King Lear was doing his job going to meet the griffin. But Malka thinks I'm a sheep too. The most stupid, aggravating sheep she ever had to guard, forever wandering away into some kind of danger. All the way to the Midwood she had trotted quietly alongside the king's horse. But now that we were alone again, she came rushing up and bounced all over me, barking like thunder and knocking me down hard, the way she does whenever I'm not where she wants me to be. I always brace myself when I see her coming, but it never helps. What she does then, before I'm on my feet, is take the hem of my smock in her jaws and start tugging me in the direction she thinks I should go. But this time she suddenly got up, as though she'd forgotten all about me, and she stared past me at the midwood with all the white showing in her eyes and a low sound coming out of her that I don't think she knew she could make. And the next moment she was gone, racing into the forest with foam flying from her mouth and her big ragged ears flat back. I called, but she couldn't have heard me, baying and barking the way she was. Well, I didn't have any choice. King Lear and Schmendrick and Molly all had a choice, going after the Midwood Griffin, but Malka was my dog, and she didn't know what she was facing. And I couldn't let her face it by herself. So there wasn't anything else for me to do. I took an enormous long breath and looked around me, and then I walked into the forest after her. Actually, I ran as long as I could, and then I walked until I could run again, and then I ran some more. There aren't any paths into the Midwood, because nobody goes there. So it wasn't hard to see where 3 horses had pushed through the undergrowth, and then a dog's tracks on top of the hoof prints. It was very quiet, with no wind, not one bird calling, no sound but my own panting. I couldn't even hear Malka anymore. I was hoping that maybe they'd come on the griffin while it was asleep, and King Lear had already killed it in its nest. I didn't think so, though. He'd probably have decided it wasn't honorable to attack a sleeping griffin, and wakened it up for a fair fight. I hadn't known him very long, but I knew what he'd do. And then, a little way ahead of me, the whole forest exploded. It was too much noise for me to sort it out in my head. There was Malka, absolutely howling, and birds bursting up everywhere out of the brush, and Schmendrick, or the king, or someone was shouting, only I couldn't make out any of the words. And underneath it all was something that wasn't loud at all, a sound somewhere between a growl and that terrible soft call like a frightened child. And then, just as I broke into the clearing, the rattle and scrape of knives, only much louder this time, as the griffin shot straight up with the sun on its wings. Its cold golden eyes bit into mine, and its beak was open so wide you could see down and down the blazing red gullet. It filled the sky, and King Lear, astride his black mare, filled the clearing. He was as huge as the griffin, and his sword was the size of a boar spear, and he shook it at the griffin, daring it to light down and fight him on the ground. But the griffin was staying out of range, circling overhead to get a good look at these strange new people. And Malka was utterly off her head, screaming and hurling herself into the air again and again, snapping at the griffin's lion feet and eagle claws, but coming down each time without so much as an iron feather between her teeth. I lunged and caught her in the air, trying to drag her away before the griffin turned on her. But she fought me, scratching my face with her own dull dog claws, until I had to let her go. The last time she leapt, the griffin suddenly stooped and caught her full on her side with one huge wing, so hard she couldn't get a sound out, no more than I could. She flew all the way across the clearing, slammed into a tree, fell to the ground, and after that she didn't move. Molly told me later that was when King Lear struck for the griffin's lion heart. I mean, I didn't see it. I was flying across the clearing myself, throwing myself over Malka, just in case the griffin came after her again, and I didn't see anything except her staring eyes and the blood on her side. But I did hear the griffin's roar when it happened, and when I could turn my head, I saw the blood splashing along its side, and the black legs squinching up against its belly, the way you do when you're really hurting. King Lear shouted like a boy. He threw that great sword as high as the griffin and snatched it back again, and then he charged toward the griffin as it wobbled lower and lower, with its crippled lion half dragging it out of the air. It landed with a saggy thump, just like Malka. And there was a moment when I was absolutely sure it was dead. I remember, I was thinking, very far away, this is good. I'm glad. I'm sure I'm glad. But Schmendrick was screaming at the king, "2 hearts! 2 hearts!" until his voice split with it. And Molly was on me, trying to drag me away from the griffin, and I was hanging on to Malka. She'd gotten so heavy, and I don't know what else was happening right then, because all I was seeing and thinking about was Malka, and all I was feeling was her heart not beating under mine. And she guarded my cradle when I was born. I cut my teeth on her poor ears, and she never made one sound. My mother says so. King Lear wasn't seeing or hearing any of us. There was nothing in the world for him but the griffin, which was flopping and struggling lopsidedly in the middle of the clearing. I couldn't help feeling sorry for it even then, even after it had killed Malka and my friends, and all the sheep and goats too, and I don't know how many else. And King Lear must have felt the same way, because he got down from his black mare and went straight up to the griffin, and he spoke to it. Lowering his sword until the tip was on the ground, he said, "You were a noble and terrible adversary, surely the last such I will ever confront. We have accomplished what we were born to do, the two of us. I thank you for your death." And on that last word, the griffin had him. It was the eagle, lunging at him, dragging the lion half along the way I'd been dragging Malka's dead weight. And King Lear stepped back, swinging the sword fast enough to take off the griffin's head, but it was faster than he was. The dreadful beak caught him at the waist, shearing through his armor the way an axe would smash through a pie crust, and he doubled over without any sound that I heard, looking like a wet wash on the line. There was blood, and worse, and I couldn't have said if he were dead or alive. I thought the griffin was going to bite him in two. I shook loose from Molly. She was calling to Schmendrick to do something, but of course he couldn't, and she knew it, because he'd promised King Lear that he wouldn't interfere by magic, whatever happened. But I wasn't a magician, and I hadn't promised anything to anybody. I told Malka I'd be right back. The griffin didn't see me coming. It was bending its head down over King Lear, hiding with its wings. The lion part, trailing along so limply in the dust, made it more fearful to see, though I can't say why, and it was making a sort of cooing and purring sound all the time. I had a big rock in my left hand, and a dead branch in my right, and I was bawling something, but I don't remember what. I mean, you can scare wolves away from a flock sometimes if you run at them like that, determined. And I can throw things with either hand. Wilfred found that out when I was still small. And the griffin looked up fast when the rock hit it in the side of the neck. It didn't like that, but it was busy with King Lear, too busy with King Lear to bother me. I didn't think for a minute that my branch was going to be any use on even a half-dead griffin, but I threw it as far as I could, so that the griffin would look away for a moment. And as soon as it did, I made a little run, and a big sprawling dive for the hilt of the king's sword, which was sticking out under him where he'd fallen. I knew I could lift it, because of having buckled it on him when we set out together. But I couldn't get it free. He was too heavy, like Malka. But I wouldn't give up or let go. I kept pulling and pulling on that sword, and I didn't feel Molly pulling at me again, and I didn't notice the griffin starting to scrabble toward me over King Lear's body, and I did hear Schmendrick sounding a long way off, and I thought he was singing one of those nonsense songs he made up for me, only why would he be doing something like that just now? And then I did finally look up, to push my sweaty hair off my face, just before the griffin grabbed me up in one of its claws, yanking me away from Molly to throw me down on top of King Lear. His armor was so cold against my cheek. It was as though the armor had died with him. And the griffin looked into my eyes. That was the worst of all. Worse than the pain where the claw had me. Worse than not seeing my parents and stupid Wilfred anymore. Worse than knowing that I hadn't been able to save either the king or Malka. Griffins can't talk. Dragons do, but only to heroes, King Lear told me. But those golden eyes were saying into my eyes, yes, I will die soon, but you are all dead now, all of you, and I will pick your bones before the ravens have mine. And your folk will remember what I was and what I did to them, when there is no one left in your vile, pitiful anthill who remembers your name. So I have won. And I knew it was true. Then there wasn't anything but that beak and that burning gullet opening over me. And then there was. I thought it was a cloud. I was so dazed and terrified that I really thought it was a white cloud, only traveling so low and so fast that it smashed the griffin off King Lear and away from me, and sent me tumbling into Molly's arms at the same time. She held me tightly, practically smothering me. And it wasn't until I wiggled my head that I saw what had come to us. And I can see it still in my mind. I see it right now. They don't look anything like horses. I don't know where people get that notion. 4 legs and a tail, yes, but the hooves are split like a deer's hooves or a goat's, and the head is smaller and more pointy than a horse's head. And the whole body is different from a horse. It's like saying a snowflake looks like a cow. The horn looks too long and heavy for the body. You can't even imagine how a neck that delicate can hold up a horn that size. But it can. Schmendrick was on his knees, with his eyes closed and his lips moving, as though he was still singing. And Molly kept whispering, Amalthea, Amalthea. Not to me, not to anybody. The unicorn was facing the griffin across the king's body. Its front feet were skittering and dancing a little, but its back legs were setting themselves to charge the way rams do, only rams put their heads down, while the unicorn held its head high, so that the horn caught the sunlight and glowed like a seashell. It gave a cry that made me want to dive back into Molly's skirt and cover my ears. It was so raw and so hurt. And then its head did go down. Dying or not, the griffin put up a furious fight. It came hopping to meet the unicorn, for then it was out of the way at the last minute, with its bloody beak snapping at the unicorn's legs as it flashed by. But each time that happened, the unicorn would turn instantly, much quicker than a horse could have turned, and come charging back before the griffin could get itself braced again. It wasn't a bit fair. But I didn't feel sorry for the griffin anymore. The last time, the unicorn slashed sideways with its horn, using it like a club, and knocked the griffin clean off its feet. But it was up before the unicorn could turn, and it actually leapt into the air, dead lion half and all, just high enough to come down on the unicorn's back, raking with its eagle claws and trying to bite through the unicorn's neck, the way it did with King Lear. And I screamed then. I couldn't help it. But the unicorn reared up until I thought it was going to go over backward, and it flung the griffin to the ground, whirled and drove its horn straight through the iron feathers to the eagle heart. And it trampled the body for a good while after. But it didn't need to. Schmendrick and Molly ran to King Lear. They didn't look at the griffin, or even pay very much attention to the unicorn. I wanted to go to Malka, but I followed them to where he lay. I had seen what the griffin had done to him, closer than they had. I didn't see how he could still be alive. But he was, just barely. He opened his eyes when we kneeled beside him, and he smiled so sweetly at us all, and he said, Listen, I should have a bath, shouldn't I? I didn't cry. Molly didn't cry. Schmendrick did. He said, No, Majesty, no, you do not need bathing, truly. King Lear looked puzzled. But I smell bad, listen. I think I must have wet myself. And he reached for my hand and he held it so hard. Little one, he said, little one, I know you. Do not be ashamed of me because I am old. And I squeezed his hand back as hard as I could. Hello, Your Majesty, I said. Hello. I didn't know what else to say. And then his face was suddenly young and happy and wonderful, and he was gazing far past me, reaching towards something with his eyes. I felt a breath on my shoulder, and I turned my head and saw the unicorn. It was bleeding from a lot of deep scratches and bites, especially around its neck. But all you could see in its dark eyes was King Lear. I moved aside so it could get to him, but when I turned back, the king was gone. I'm 9, almost 10. I know when people are gone. The unicorn stood over King Lear's body for a long time. I went off after a while to sit beside Malka, and Molly came and sat with me. But Schmendrick stayed, kneeling by King Lear, and he was talking to the unicorn. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could tell from his face that he was asking for something, a favor. My mother says she can always tell before I open my mouth. The unicorn wasn't answering, of course. They can't talk either, I'm almost sure. But Schmendrick kept at it, until the unicorn turned its head and looked at him. And then he stopped. And he stood up and walked away by himself. The unicorn stayed where she was. Molly was saying how brave Malka had been, and telling me that she'd never known another dog who attacked a griffin. She asked if Malka had ever had pups, and I said yes, but none of them was Malka. It was very strange. She was trying hard to make me feel better, and I was trying hard to comfort her, because she couldn't. But all the while I felt so cold, almost as far away from everything as Malka had gone. I closed her eyes, the way you do with people. And I sat there, and I stroked her side over and over. I didn't notice the unicorn. Molly must have, but she didn't say anything. I went on petting Malka, and I didn't look up until the horn came slanting over my shoulder. Close to, you could see blood drying in the shining spirals, but I wasn't afraid. I wasn't anything. And then the horn touched Malka, very lightly, right where I was stroking her. And Malka opened her eyes. It took her a while to understand that she was alive. It took me longer. She ran her tongue out first, panting and panting, looking so thirsty. We could hear a stream trickling somewhere close, and Molly went and found it, and brought water back in her cupped hands, and Malka lapped it all up, and then she tried to stand and fell down like a puppy, but she kept trying, and at last she was properly on her feet, and she tried to lick my face, but she missed it the first few times. I only started crying when she finally managed it. When she saw the unicorn, she did a funny thing. She stared at it for a moment, and she bowed or curtsied in a dog way, stretching out her front legs and putting her head down on the ground between them. The unicorn nosed at her very gently, so as not to knock her over again, and it looked at me for the first time. Or maybe I really looked at it for the first time, past the horn and the hooves and the magical whiteness, all the way down into those endless eyes. And what they did somehow, the unicorn's eyes, was to free me from the griffin's eyes. Because the awfulness of what I'd seen there didn't go away when the griffin died. Not even when Malka came alive again. But the unicorn had all the world in her eyes, all the world I'm never going to see. But it doesn't matter, because now I have seen it, and it's beautiful, and I was in there too. And when I think of Jane and Luli and my Felicitas, who could only talk with her eyes, just like the unicorn, I will think of them and not the griffin. That's how it was when the unicorn and I looked at each other. I didn't see if the unicorn said goodbye to Molly and Schmendrick, and I didn't see when it went away. I didn't want to. I did hear Schmendrick saying, "A dog." I nearly kill myself singing her to Lear, calling her as no other has ever called a unicorn. And she brings back not him, but the dog. And here I'd always thought she had no sense of humor. But Molly said she loved him too. That's why she let him go. Keep your voice down. And I was going to tell her it didn't matter, that I knew Schmendrick was saying that because he was so sad, but she came over and petted Malka with me, and I didn't have to. She said, "We will escort you and Malka home now, as befits two great ladies, and then we will take the king home too." "And I'll never see you again," I said, "no more than I'll see him." Molly asked me, "How old are you, Suze?" 9, I said. Almost 10. You know that. You can whistle? I nodded. Molly looked around quickly, as though she were going to steal something. She bent close to me and she whispered, I will give you a present, Suze, but you are not to open it until the day when you turn 17. On that day, you must walk out, away from your village, walk out all alone into some quiet place that is special to you. And you must whistle, like this. And she whistled a little ripple of music for me to whistle back to her, repeating and repeating it until she was satisfied that I had it exactly. Don't whistle it any more, she told me. Don't whistle it out loud again, not once, until your 17th birthday. But keep whistling it inside you. Do you understand the difference, Suze? I'm not a baby, I said. I understand. What will happen when I do whistle it? Molly smiled at me. She said, someone will come to you. Maybe the greatest magician in the world. Maybe only an old lady with a soft spot for valiant and impudent children. And she cupped my cheek in her hand. And just maybe, even a unicorn. Because beautiful things will always want to see you again, Suze, and be listening for you. Take an old lady's word for it. Someone will come. And they put King Lear on his own horse. And I rode with Schmendrick, and they came all the way home with me, right to the door, to tell my mother and father that the griffin was dead, and that I had helped. And you should have seen Wilfred's face when they said that. And then they both hugged me. And Molly said in my ear, remember, not until you're 17. And they rode away, taking the king back to his castle to be buried among his own folk. And I had a cup of cold milk, and went out with Malka and my father to pen the flock for the night. So that's what happened to me. I practiced the music Molly taught me in my head all the time. I even dream it some nights, but I don't ever whistle it out loud. I talk to Malka about our adventure, because I have to talk to someone. And I promise her that when the time comes, she'll be there with me in the special place I've already picked out. She'll be an old dog lady then, of course, but it doesn't matter. Someone will come to us both. I hope it's them, those two. I mean, a unicorn is very nice, but they're my friends. I want to feel Molly holding me again, and to hear the stories she didn't have time to tell me. And I want to hear Schmendrick singing that silly song. Susley, Susley, speaking loosely, you disturb my oozly goozly, Susley, Susley, would you choosely to become my squoozly squoozly? I can wait. That was Two Hearts by Peter Beagle, the sequel to The Last Unicorn.